The Ukraine war is the biggest conflict Europe has seen since World War II, and it's the first to feature some of the newest weapons of the 21st century. But it's also made the United States military realize that it might not be up to the task of fighting a modern conventional conflict. Lessons learned from Ukraine are changing everything, from the way America fights to even redesigning some of its most well-known combat systems. The Ukraine war will soon have been raging for 2 years, as Russia continues to throw itself against the brick wall that is Ukraine. The once mighty former superpower, feared by the world, and widely considered the second most powerful army on Earth, is a shadow of its former self, and has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia is far more bark than bite. But that doesn't mean that this has been an easy war, and lessons learned here indicate that nobody, including the US military, is prepared for a conflict of this scale. The first lesson the US learned is how voraciously modern war consumes stocks of weapons and ammunition. Both Russia and Ukraine are expending thousands of shells a day, going through nearly a full year's worth of production in just 1 month of fighting. The war between Russia and Ukraine has become a numbers game for Russia. Long believed to be a capable modern military power, Russia is instead forced to resort to brute force to attempt to break Ukraine's military. Meanwhile, Ukraine is in a race against time, employing superior Western weapons and a whole lot of determination to dismantle the Russian military before it can in turn bleed Ukraine dry. The race for supplies is in full swing for both sides, and it turns out that neither side is prepared for the demands of a modern conventional war. Russia, which began with a 20-to-1 artillery advantage, is now only conducting between 5 and 6 times more shelling missions than Ukraine. For its part, Ukraine's firing about 6,000 rounds a day, but it says it needs 10,000 rounds to break Russian lines. At its peak, Russia was firing a whopping 60,000 rounds a day and still didn't manage to break Ukrainian lines. German defense manufacturer Rheinmetall has estimated that Ukraine needs 1.5 million rounds every year. Nobody knows how many artillery shells the US has stockpiled away. That information is kept confidential in order to undermine enemy efforts. But we do know that the US has supplied over 2 million shells to Ukraine throughout the conflict. However, last year, the US was only producing about 16,000 shells a month, and Europe wasn't doing much better. New legislation in both Europe and the US aims to dramatically increase production capabilities, but those are going to take time. The US is aiming to make as many as 24,000 shells by the end of 2023 and 100,000 shells a month by 2025. Combined with current European production of 300,000 shells a year at the start of 2023, the Allies are a long way off meeting Ukraine's needs. And when looking at these figures, one has to keep in mind that not all of these shells can simply be shipped off to Ukraine. Each nation has its own needs for shells to use in combat operations, training, or simply stockpiling away for the next time Russia decides to do something stupid. And every Western nation is now expanding its reserve stocks in anticipation of another major conventional war. Meaning, in the best-case scenario, Ukraine could probably receive about half of what's produced every year. This puts Ukraine in a rather precarious position as the war grinds on, which is why the West has also been expanding access to alternative munitions, like cluster shells. These controversial munitions are especially effective against infantry in trenches, but widely denounced for their habit of leaving large amounts of unexploded ordnance behind that can pose a significant risk to friendly troops and civilians years after a conflict concludes. It should be noted, though, that Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of the fighting, including even against civilian targets. We shouldn't allow ourselves to sink to Russia's level by any means, but one must remain sober and clear-eyed about Russia's historical willingness to resort to every imaginable depravity because they already have in just a year and a half of fighting. Whatever the official figure, the US clearly does not believe it has sufficient ammunition stockpiles. But even more importantly, it doesn't have the capability to produce more ammunition. Having deep reserves is nice, but artillery shells can age out after about 30 years. Even more importantly, a nation needs the ability to rapidly ramp up production of warfighting goods, and shells are amongst the most important goods. This is a critical deficiency that the US has been dealing with since the end of the Cold War, when the vast network of defense contractors were either driven out of business or consolidated into a handful of companies. Defense plants across the nation were shuttered, and very few of these were kept in any state of readiness to be reopened again in case of an emergency. On one hand, it makes sense. A military would rather have money for active capabilities like new tanks, airplanes, and equipment than for reserve capabilities like keeping arms manufacturers open and its employees paid without actually providing anything. But the war in Ukraine has shown that defense investments cannot be just for active inventory. Modern war is absolutely brutal and consumes resources at a truly apocalyptic rate. Going forward, defense investments must include investing into the ability to quickly ramp up manufacturing at large scale. Currently, the U.S. arms industry is basically a boutique shop that makes everything to order. Lockheed Martin only makes 156 F-35s a year, and only a part of those are for America's military, the rest are for its partners. Now, when specifically talking about artillery shells, the U.S. future needs come with a very specific caveat. The fighting in Ukraine is not truly an accurate representation of what a major conventional war with direct U.S. involvement would look like. The Ukrainian war very quickly turned from combined arms maneuver war to something more closely resembling the vast trench networks of World War I. This is due to Ukraine's inexperience and lack of capabilities to conduct combined arms operations. And while Russia has access to all the right equipment for it, its military is a clown factory. The U.S. military, to put it bluntly, is incredibly lethal. This is not an accident. The U.S. has invested significant resources into learning from its past mistakes and developing the best war colleges in the world. Official U.S. doctrine is to present an adversary with multiple domain challenges simultaneously in order to stress and break their ability to respond adequately to all or any of them. And it's very well equipped, and most importantly trained, to do just that. U.S. aviators regularly train to coordinate with ground forces, while planners exercise at deconflicting airspace for U.S. ground-based air defenses, so Russia can continue winning the gold medal at shooting down its own aircraft. The emphasis is on maneuver warfare in order to keep the enemy off guard and avoid the strategic quagmires of the past. And just about every weapon in the U.S. arsenal is designed for these combined arms operations. A war between the U.S. and Russia would not devolve into trench-to-trench fighting, simply because American all-domain capabilities are significantly more advanced than Russia's. This means that there's a very low likelihood of a war devolving into the quagmire that Ukraine's Eastern Front finds itself in. But that chance isn't zero. As a French parliamentary member recently said, "We believed we could do everything with airplanes," when referencing the West's lack of artillery shells. The U.S. doesn't like losing conventional wars, but it really doesn't mind taking runner-up in unconventional ones, apparently. This means that while the chance of war devolving to an artillery duel is extremely low, the U.S. wishes to be prepared. And to do that, it needs to dramatically increase both its reserve of shells and its capability to create new ones. But it's not just shells, because this war has been eating up other weapons at a prodigious rate as well. America has sent around 5,000 javelins to Ukraine since fighting began, and it's unknown how many Javelin anti-tank missiles it has left in its own stockpiles. But like artillery shells, America's looking to ramp up production here as well. About 50,000 Javelins are in service with the U.S. and its allies and partners, which means in just a year and a half, 10% of the stockpile has been sent to an active war zone. In 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. expended 5,000 Javelins. So 1 year of conventional war has expended as many Javelins as the U.S. needed in 20 years. Another lesson the U.S. has learned from the war in Ukraine is that the next major war America fights may not be as permissive an environment to its high-tech weapons as it would like. When Russia launched its initial invasion of Ukraine, it waged a largely unreported but extremely effective electronic war against its victim. Russian electronic warfare platforms completely overwhelmed Ukraine's ability to coordinate and communicate. But they worked a little too well, and in typical Russian fashion, affected Russia's own abilities to the point it had to significantly curtail the use of electronic warfare. The initial expertise in EW was quickly diminished though, as Ukraine regained its balance and Russia didn't have the upper hand anymore. What would follow is a conflict where Russia's significant EW capabilities were poorly used, though that doesn't mean that they haven't still had a significant effect. One of the first major aid packages from the US to Ukraine was thousands of secure radios to avoid the worst effects of Russian electronic warfare and help better coordinate the troops on the ground. The introduction of HIMARS was revolutionary, single-handedly making the famous fall counteroffensive of 2022 a stunning success. HIMARS uses GPS-assisted precision munitions, but as the war wore on, its effectiveness has been increasingly limited. Today, Russia is interfering with a large number of HIMARS strikes against its most sensitive targets, though it seems relatively unable to protect frontline troops from its devastating precision effects. Around May of this year, it became clear that Russia was doing a decent job of interfering with HIMARS strikes. By jamming the GPS signal the rocket uses, its precision was significantly reduced. This in turn prompted the US to rush to develop new software aimed at circumventing Russian jamming. and Ukraine and the US made striking at Russian Zytel R-330ZH jamming stations a top priority. These mobile jamming units, however, can be difficult to identify and quickly eliminate, though a leak from the Pentagon showed that US officials were strongly pushing for Russian jamming units to become priority targets over pretty much anything else. Ukraine promptly deployed special forces behind enemy lines with the sole purpose of hunting these down and destroying them. The jammers weren't just causing issues for HIMARS batteries, but for other Western-supplied precision weapons like JDAMs and precision artillery shells. The developments in Ukraine have showed how vulnerable American smart weapons can be in a near-peer conflict, and prompted both the US and Britain to work together to develop new ways of protecting their systems from jamming or eliminating adversary jamming systems. 40 years ago, early GPS units were credited with the coalition's stunning success on the ground against Iraqi forces. It wasn't just the might of Western tanks and close air support, it was the ability to navigate with extreme degrees of precision across a featureless desert. The Iraqis thought it would be impossible to move large forces in this way and thus set up their defenses toward major roads, only to be hit in the flanks by surprise attacks from the deserts. The importance of GPS has only increased since then, but so have incidents of GPS jamming and spoofing. From Ukraine to the Middle East and the South China Sea, GPS jamming and spoofing has affected everything from militaries to civilian traffic. Base systems have developed a digital GPS anti-jamming receiver, which is quickly proliferating across Western militaries, but the US has banked on encode GPS tech to make its weapons resilient to jamming. Basically, GPS 3.0, encode utilizes a new type of signal to make it much more difficult for GPS signals to be spoofed or completely jammed. It'll be transmitted in the same frequency ranges as old GPS, but users will only need part of the signal to anonymously calculate their position. GPS 3 satellites will also be able to broadcast spot coverage and regional coverage, making it extremely difficult to disrupt an incoming signal. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the US's need to purchase anti-jamming equipment and jam-resistant add-ons in its arsenal, as well as the deployment of M-code. Unfortunately, satellite launches are significantly behind schedule, and the US won't be able to make full use of its new GPS tech for years to come. The US has been carefully analyzing Russia's failures in Ukraine, an exhausting job for whoever got it, and two major points of failure have become clear. The first is a lack of battlefield command and control, with Russian military leadership often far in the rear or simply not having the tools or capabilities to coordinate a large number of troop formations at once. The second major failure is a lack of initiative by Russian troops, and this is a result of two things: low morale and poor doctrine. The US prides itself on having a force that is extremely resilient to command disruption. Junior leaders at every level are encouraged to act on their own initiative, creating a military that is highly resistant to the type of decapitation strikes Ukraine is delivering every other day. Russia, on the other hand, is the opposite, with its military entrenched in old Soviet doctrine of a heavy top-down command structure. Troops do as the higher command tells them to, and if higher command doesn't exist anymore because the general used his cell phone to call home and then Ukraine responded with a Storm Shadow strike, then they do nothing. It's never been clearer to the US that it must maintain its competitive advantage by fostering the type of carpe diem attitude that's been its hallmark since World War I. Renewed focus on NCO and junior leader training attempts to insulate US command chains from decapitation strikes. And with the proliferation of electronic warfare and radio jamming, US units must be able to operate on their own while being out of contact for prolonged periods of time. This means more individual and junior leader training, and to counter the same morale problem that's plaguing the Russian military, the daily allotment of HUAs in the US military has been increased threefold. The Ukrainian war has shown that US combat vehicle design might be outdated as well, though, and it's been scrambling to correct that mistake. The greatest killer of tanks in Ukraine has been the anti-tank missile, with a combination of landmines and artillery being a close second. Tank-on-tank combat accounts for only a fraction of total tank kills, as the anti-tank guided missile has proven it is the king of killing tanks, especially if you have awful armor doctrine like Russia and don't properly support them with dismounted infantry. Most anti-tank missiles work by attacking the thin top armor of a tank, often penetrating the turret and delivering a shaped rod of molten metal which punches into the tank and does very unkind things to any crew in the way. The US has taken note of the way Russian tanks have been savaged by ATGMs and now believes that it's time for some significant redesign of the legendary Abrams tank. It might look like America's taking a page from Russia's book, except it was the US who originally pioneered the concept of a remotely controlled turret. This is what the Abrams might be bringing to the table in its next iteration, as it moves its vulnerable crew out of the turret and into an armored capsule at the front of the tank. All the way back in 1980, the US experimented with the concept, but because the height of technology at the time was the Sony Walkman, it was deemed too immature a concept to risk bringing to the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Thus, the US opted for traditional turrets on top of the Abrams. But that's changing as the US looks at the use of a remote-controlled turret once more. This would make the crew safer even from an anti-tank missile, as it moves them out of the likely path of penetration. It also means the US will have to adopt an auto-loader, however, something that it hasn't wanted to do so far. But in the end, America might not have a choice, because even though the ATGM protective measures are becoming increasingly more advanced, the fact of the matter is that the Abrams tank is already too fat for its own good. And studies from Ukraine show that to be survivable, the tank as it is going to have to put on even more pounds. Modern Abrams tanks are already too heavy for safe transport on many different types of vehicles, and far too heavy to safely cross most bridges. Adding more weight for more protective measures simply isn't an option, but the Abrams might have to take on the weight of additional countermeasures by adopting a remote-controlled turret. Such a turret could be made much smaller than a traditional turret and be less well-armored as there's no crew inside to protect. This would allow the tank to shed tons of pounds and come down to something a bit more manageable for US logisticians. Tank manufacturer General Dynamics already revealed its Abrams X program back in March 2023, featuring a remote-controlled turret that could be the future of the legendary Abrams. Ukraine has delivered one final lesson to the US military, and it's one with a significance so important that the US has taken unprecedented action to immediately meet the challenge. It's estimated that Ukraine uses up to 10,000 drones a month. This includes drones lost to anti-drone weapons and jamming, as well as suicide drones used to deliver explosive love letters to the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow. On September 20th, Ukraine launched the largest drone attack in history, using over 100 drones to attack Russian defenses and facilities in Crimea. The attack was a stunning success, with the drones drawing the attention of Russian air defenses and forcing them to expend their missiles. The attritable swarm then continued onto its various targets and opened up the skies for Neptune missiles to strike at the Russian naval HQ. From attriting enemy air defenses to recon and spotting for artillery, drones are the weapon of the war, and the US has realized just how critical these sometimes very small weapons are for fighting a modern conflict. Despite being completely overmatched in every category, Ukraine's advantage in drones has been one of its biggest saving graces, and it's used that overmatch to make life absolutely miserable for the Russians. Aircraft and radar systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars have been destroyed or severely damaged by $1,000 drones, and that's an economic exchange that no country can hope to win. The US has prioritized anti-drone weapons across the entire military. In any future conflict, it's inevitable that enemy agents will strike far behind the front lines using disposable drones. The B-2 bomber is the world's second most capable bomber now that its successor, the B-21, is operational, but it can easily be destroyed by a 3-ship flight of a $200 DJI drone equipped with explosives and launched from close to its flight line. Everything from multi-million-dollar aircraft and systems to civilian infrastructure is vulnerable to drone attacks, and point drone defense weapons are a critical need for the American military. But traditional point defense weapons use expensive interceptors, and that's simply not an option. Again, swapping million-dollar Patriot missiles for $1,000 drones is a quick way to lose a war. Instead, the US is turning to directed energy weapons, and it's already fielding the most powerful battlefield lasers in the world with more to come. But the drone itself is a weapon supremely useful not just to overmatched powers like Ukraine, but even the world's most powerful military. In a stunning announcement, the US Department of Defense announced the Replicator program, aimed at producing and fielding, quote, thousands upon thousands, end quote, of drones in the US military by 2025. That's just 2 years, and the US is expecting to have massive drone swarms not just in inventory but in active use. Drone swarms are supremely useful, as Ukraine has proven, and the US has named a specific adversary for its future drones, China. Citing China's growing number superiority in the Pacific, the DoD is turning to vast swarms of drones to level the playing field, and then tip it in its advantage. These drones will do everything from recon to saturating enemy defenses and even delivering suicide attacks. And Replicator aims to have vast quantities of expendable drones for use in both sky and sea. America is an apt pupil of war, and the Ukraine war has been a masterclass on the challenges of future combat and how ill-prepared in places the US and its allies have been. However, the advantage of the United States military over any potential adversary is its dedication to professional military education with the best war colleges in the world, where U.S. service members attend class side by side with allies and partners from around the world. If the U.S. is going to keep its competitive advantage, though, it's got to keep evolving and avoid letting any amount of hubris stagnate its military culture. Now go check out why Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a failure, or click this other video instead.